Music theory with OneNote. Chords named by mode and modal half step, this time adding another layer of depth with a color concept. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 2192 OneNote. Chords named by mode and modal half steps with color. List of presentations on the right, which we plan on adding plenty more to shortly. Also noting in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend all our time on music theory, but we have another similarly numbered and named presentation where we build these tables in Excel, practicing Excel, music, and simply table visualization skills, all great skills at the same time. Let's get a quick overview of our overall objective, that being to maximize, optimize our use of color to better understand music theory and better create tools such as our fretboard to understand and navigate it. Noting on this fretboard, we have the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top, the typical color systems that are very utilitarian that we would like to apply is a color system that is by point and a color system that is by distance. The color system by point could be tied to the notes, as in this 7-note collection around the key of C, the Ionian node being the yellow-green node, this being what I would call position number 1. If we then move to the 7-note collection around the key of D, D now being the Ionian, you see that the note colors are the same, associating the color with the actual note. However, it's often practical for us, though, to associate the color with what I would call the continents in our global analogy, the 7 continents and 5 oceans on the fretboard, meaning we still have the point of the color, same color setup, but it is now tied to the modes, similar to a Nashville number system, the Ionian node being the yellow-green. If we move from the 7-note collection around the key of C to the 7-note collection around the key of D, you could see the color moved up with it, so that this, what I would call position number 1, can now be seen with the color pattern that has moved up. Now, we would also like a color pattern to show distance, which we call intervals, very useful in particular for building chords, which is our objective today. So this is a fretboard where we've broken out each of the frets to have a point as well as a distance measurement. And so now if we look at the same position, position number 1, we have the measurement here around the 7-note collection, around the key of C, it being a perfect first, which I would rather call a 0 note away from the Ionian node, 0th modal half step. We'll talk more about that later, but you can see the color is going to be a distinct color for that distance, noting in this system, we would have to have the colors change from the perspective of each of the 7 notes within the collection, which we can build into like a fretboard in Excel. And so that's a doable thing to do. So if I moved this up then to the collection here, or if I made the Dorian now the center point, you could see that this Dorian is now the one that has the perfect first tied to it. So it's a very practical system to have a color applied, and that's what we're working on here. So let's go through the general idea of our color systems, and then we're going to add the new component, which is going to be the chords. So just to give a precursor of that, the chords are built off of the nodes or the modal points, and therefore we can use the same color system as on the modal points to apply the chords, possibly using a lightness factor to assign to either a 3-note chord, a 4-note chord, a 5-note chord, a 6 or 7-note chord. Because there's 7 notes in the collection, we're going to be thinking about normal chords, meaning chords constructed from any of the 12 7-note collections, looking at the relative positions, which are the nodes or the Nashville numbers to them. Noting to do that, we're gonna have to think about the best way to visualize the chords, which we'll talk about shortly as well. But let's give a quick recap so we really understand our color system. So remember the points, we can assign color to the point. So let's just give a quick recap. An A is red, an A sharp or B flat is orange, the B 3-note is yellow, the 4-note is a C note, it's yellow-green. And if we apply the 7-note collection starting from counting out our formula, whole, whole, half, whole, whole, half, from the C, then we're going to say that's going to be the Ionian node, and we're going to say that's the Ionian. That means that I can apply that same color system to the A up top if we're working in the 7-note collection around the A major. In that case, instead of coloring the A red, we would color it green because it's not tied to the note, but rather to the relative position in the collection of 7 notes. Okay, so then the C sharp or D flat is going to be green. The 6th note, which is the D note, is going to be spring green. It's a whole step up. That's our Dorian node color as well. So the generic Dorian node color. And then the 7 note is a D sharp or E flat, which is cayenne. And then the 8th note is E. It's going to be sky blue. And once again, that is in our pattern from the C major, whole, whole. So that's going to be the Phrygian node, that sky blue. So the 9 is F. That's going to be blue. And that's going to be the Lydian node as well, because it's whole, whole, half in our formula from the C. And then the F sharp or G flat or 10 is violet. And then the 11 note or G is magenta. And that is going to be whole, whole, right? It goes whole, whole, half, whole. So that magenta is in our formula. It's going to be the Mixolydian node. And then the 12 is G sharp or A flat, which is rose. And then if we go around to the circle, this goes back up to the A up top, which is going to be the Aeolian. And so that's going to be our Aeolian node. And then A sharp or B flat. And then the B, which is going to be yellow again. And that's going to be the Locrian. All right, so there's our color system based on just the 12 notes. And this is our color system based on still the points, but the points not listed by note, the points listed by our analogy of the continents. If we imagine the fretboard as a globe spinning around, then we're always going to be dealing with 7 continents that have the same relative position, and we can give them a fixed number system to the continent, which is based on or pulled from, similar to the Nashville number system, the major scale. So we took the major scale color system and applied out to all the nodes when we're using that system. So that means yellow-green is going to be the Ionian node. The Dorian is going to be the spring green, the Phrygian sky blue, the Lydian normal blue, the Mixolydian magenta, the Aeolian is red, and the Locrian is the yellow. Crazy Locrian is the yellow. All right. So then we also have half steps that we have to deal with. So the other way we can measure things is by modal half steps. So remember, if I have a collection of 7 notes, I could say, what's the distance from any modal point? And I would call that a modal half step. So you have half and whole steps through the modes. Now, there's not a same distance between each of the modal half steps, but if I know the starting point and ending point, then I can talk in terms of modal half steps, which I'm going to use just a gray tone to indicate. So I'm going to call it shades of gray. So we have a 0 shades of gray, 1 shade of gray, 2 shades of gray, 3 shades of gray to indicate if we're going 1 half step up, 2 half steps up, 3 half steps up, and so on and so forth for our modal half steps. So that's a distance term. The other distance term we have is the number of half steps. This was, modal half steps, number of note half steps, which is our fundamental unit of distance on the guitar. So in the middle range, in the middle of the piano, around C4, but I'm often thinking going from A to A, 440A up, that would be orange flame if you don't go anywhere. Amber if you go 1 note up. Chartreuse if you go 2 notes up. Lime if you go 3 notes up. Mint if you go 4 notes up. 5 notes up is aqua. 6 notes up is electric sky. 7 notes up is azure. 9 notes up is grape. 8 notes up is grape. 9 notes up is orchid. 10 notes up is fuchsia. and 11 notes up is crimson or punch. I think punch would be easy. I'm going to go with punch. So that means, and then if we go beyond that, a distance beyond that, we're going around the circle. So it still has a local distance of, if I go 12 steps up, local distance is 0 if we think about it as a clock, because we went clockwise around the lap back to the same spot. It's still orange flame, or just flame maybe. And then if I go 13, I'm going around the clock plus one more step. So it's still amber, but it's going to be a shade lighter, and so on and so forth. If I go on the opposite direction, one step back or counterclockwise on the clock, then that's going to be equivalent to a local distance of 11 clockwise, would be 1 counterclockwise. It would be the same punch color, but now we're going to make it darker to show the octave darker. So this is going to be our distance. Now these distances could be given, like this distance of 2 could be given as 2 half steps, 1 whole step, or a major second. I don't care what you call it. The baseline distance is 2 notes, and all of those are going to be the chartreuse. Chartreuse means you went 2 half steps, you went a whole step, you went a major second. I don't care what you call it. I don't care if you call this one a minor third, or if you call it 3 half steps, or if you call it a whole step and a half step. They're all the same distance, and they're all going to be the same lime color. All right. So then given that, we can go on over to our chord construction. Okay, so the chord construction is kind of a mess in normal chord construction terms, and in part, that's because we tried to stack thirds on each other instead of really thinking about the most functional, easy way that would work from a playing standpoint, and therefore, I propose that when you're playing, you would use a modal kind of chord system. So let me show you what I mean. If we're in the Ionian, so we have an Ionian chord. I'm looking at a 7-note collection. We're always working in Western music, typically in 7-note collections. All of the chords that you typically think of are generally built off of, you can say, the major scale, but they're built off of usually like the 7-note collection, but it gets wonky because they kind of started with just the major and minor scale, major and then the minor scale. So, but now we want to be able to play within, any mode, basically, to determine that as kind of our root. So, for example, if we say it's a C major, we can call it a C major. I'd rather call it an Ionian chord, right? It's an Ionian 2 or a 3-note Ionian chord. Why do I want to call it and you could put the note in there. Notice I could say it's an Ionian C2 chord. That would give me the node that I'm on, the note that I'm on, and the 2 represents the distance in what I'm calling modal whole steps. In other words, how do you build a chord? You skip every other note. You're starting on the Ionian node, which is Nashville number system number 1, and then you go up 2, which would give you 1, 2, 3, land you on the 3rd from a Nashville number system, the Phrygian, and then you go from the 3 up another 2, 4, 5, which would give you the 5 or Aeolian. So Mixolydian. So from a nodal standpoint, the C major can be defined as the Ionian major, an Ionian, Phrygian, and Mixolydian node, which is highly useful to be able to explain it like that, right? But notice that putting a C in there is redundant. If you tell somebody, hey, look, we're going to be playing a song in the key of C around the 7-note collection, around the C, they already know the C. You don't need to tell them the C anymore. It'd be easier to tell them you're playing around the Ionian. Why is that better? Because then you can just tell them the 7-note collection, and then you can easily transpose it. Say you're working with a singer. Wouldn't it make more sense to say, instead of saying we're playing in C major, we're playing the collection of notes around the C major, but then they want to move it up because they sing better with the collection of notes around another key, like an A. Well, if you just say, okay, now we're in the collection of notes around the A, you still have everything the same. I don't need to change the name of the note. It's the Ionian 2, right? Because why? Because if you look at the fretboard down here, if you're playing in this position, here's the C, and you just move the entire shape back, then this is going to be the lime green color, and it'll be the Ionian. See, so from a chord standpoint, everything is movable, which to me is the point. If you name everything by the nodes, which is naturally makes the most sense from a functional standpoint. Okay, how do we fit the color into this then? Well, so I can color this two different ways. I can color it by the note, which is C, which is lime green, but I can also color it by the node, which is C. Now, notice if I color it by the note name, it's going to have a problem because there's different C chords. It might be a C major, or I might be playing in C minor, and they're both C chords, which would have the same color. That's the problem. But if I use an absolute color system based on the nodes, then we don't really have a problem, right? This is the Ionian chord. I don't care if it's a C Ionian or if we're playing in the collection of notes around the A, it would be the A Ionian chord, which I'm going to say is going to be baseline, this lime green color. And then I'm going to try to give a color system that will add, which will tell us just by color how many notes are in the chord. So I asked ChatGPT, how many notes could we have in the chord of a C chord? Well, we start with a triad, and then we can add another note. So to have a 4-note chord, which means you're going to add the 7 from a scale degree standpoint, and then we can add another note, which would be a 5-note chord, which means you're going to add the 9, which is actually kind of like the 2, and then you're going to have a 5-note chord, a 6-note chord, and a 7-note chord, right? So if you start at 3 and you go up to 7, you can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different normal chords, meaning you start from the triad and then you add another note until you add all 7 notes in the collection, not adding them side by side, but rather skipping through the notes from a scale standpoint, that being 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 is a compound interval that is really the 2, 11 is a compound interval that's the 4, and 13 is a compound that's the 6. That gets you all 7 notes in the 7-note collection. So this will be the color scheme. So we're going to say, hey, ChatGPT, give me the normal color for this Ionian node. This is what we did. We said, we want this yellow-green, which is that color, but then change the lightness so it gives me a variation of the lightness between 0.9, 0.7, 0.5, 0.3, and 0.1. So that a 3-note Ionian chord is going to be the lightest color. It's still lime green, but the lightness factors is really light. So I'm going to call that a shade 3, let's say, lime yellow green chord, which is an Ionian triad, right? And then a shade 4, because it's a 4-note chord. Shade 4, even though this lightness is 7, I'm going to call this a shade 4 Ionian lime green. Shade 4 yellow green, which is going to be a 4-note chord. Shade 5, which stands for 5 notes in it, shade 5 yellow green is going to be a 5-note chord, shade 6, 6-note chord, and so on. So what does that do then? That means that a C major, I'm going to show this yellow green, but it makes more sense if we name it by node or modal chord. It's a 3-note Ionian chord, and I could add the C. It's an Ionian C chord, but I'm just going to say I'm in the collection of notes of C, so I'm just going to say it's an I2 chord or a 3-note Ionian chord, meaning you start at the Ionian and then you count the last note is going to be 2 modal whole steps up. In other words, if I'm on the Ionian node, how do we get there? We go 0 shades of gray up, meaning 0 modal half steps, and then you're going to go 2 shades of gray up, 2 modal half steps up, and 4 shades of gray from the beginning, or you're going to skip every other note, right? You start on this node and then go up 2 and then go up another 2, which would mean a full distance of 4 from the starting point. And from a scale degree, you'd start at 1, not 0. because the scale degrees are off by 1 with their measurement. So if I start at 1, if I rename the point to 1, I get 1 plus 2 is 3 plus 2 is 5. This way makes more sense because if I can keep the modal system the same, then all I have to do is say, hey, look, it's an Ionian 3-note Ionian chord, or it's an Ionian 2 chord, meaning you start on the Ionian node, which from a Nashville number system or permanent number system is the 1, and then you go up 2, which gets you to the 3 point, which is the Phrygian, and then you go up 2, which gets you to the 5 point, which is Mixolydian. So what is a 3-note Ionian chord made of? By Nashville number nodes, you hold down the Ionian, the Phrygian, and the Mixolydian continents or nodes, right? What if I add another one? If I add another one, then it's going to be a shade darker. I'm going to call that shade 4 yellow-green because it's a 4-note chord. We would call that a C major 7, the 7 representing the last note in the scale. But it would be easier, so that means you're going to have a triad and then the 7, because you're always assume that you're going to have all the ones before it and the next one, which is the 7. It would be easier to just say it's going to be a 4-note Ionian chord. You could say Ionian C chord, but again, if you know you're in the collection of notes of the C major, then I could just call it the Ionian C chord, right? You're going to go from the Ionian node, it's a 4-note Ionian chord, meaning from the Ionian node, you're going to go up 2 modal half steps, 2 shades of gray, 4 modal half steps, meaning, or another 2, which would be 4 from the start, 4 shades of gray, and then 6 modal half steps, meaning that if you start on the Ionian, you're going to go up 2, land on 3, which is the Phrygian, go up another 2, land on 5, which is the Mixolydian, up another 2, which is 7, which is the Locrian. So a 4-note chord from a 4-note Ionian chord is Ionian, Phrygian, Mixian, Locrian, or the 1, 3, 5, 7 nodes from a permanent nodal or Nashville number node system. All right, what if we had a 5-note chord? Then I'm going to make that 5 shades of what we're on 5, right? 1, 2, 3, yeah, 5 shades of yellow green. So we could call that then a C major 9. Now the 9 again, they kind of made up a 9, right? There is no 9, but they made a compound interval because it's supposed to indicate that all of the ones before it, the triad and the 7, are still included, although you could drop them if you wanted to, but in theory those are included, and now you're adding the 9, which is like equivalent to the 2, which is the one that you skipped, except it's usually an octave up, right? But it would be easier to just call it an Ionian 4, right? It's just an Ionian 4. Why? Because then it would be 4 modal half steps up, or it's a 5-note Ionian chord. You just skip every other node, meaning it starts at 0, then you go 2 modal half steps up, 2 shades of gray, and then 4 modal half steps up, or 2 from there, and then 6 modal half steps up, or 2 from there, and then 2 more up to get to the 8, which I don't have a shades of gray for because we don't really, 8 would take us around the circle back to the beginning. In other words, if I'm on the 1 and I go up 2 to 3, that's Phrygian, up 2 to 5, that's Mixolydian, up 2 to 7 is Locrian, up 2 gets me back to 2 because there's only 7 modes. So that would be a 1, 3, 5, 7, 2 or Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Dorian chord. All right, and then if I say it's a 5, if I go to the next one, it's a 6-note chord. We're going to say this is the 6th shade of yellow-green. It would be a C minor 11. The 11 is equivalent to the 4. It would be easier to call it just an Ionian 5-note chord or an Ionian C 5, which means it's going to be 5 modal half steps up, which means it's a 6-note Ionian chord. Or in other words, if I start on the 1, it's going to be plus 2 is 3, plus 2 is 5, plus 2 is 7, plus 2 takes us back to 2 because there's only 7 modes, 7 notes, and plus 2 gets me to 4, right? So it's a 1, 3, 5, 7, 2, 4. Now, of course, in practice, if you're going to play that 4, which is like the 11, right, the one that's the last note, you're possibly going to drop some of these ones in the middle in practice. But the chord system is designed so that you kind of assume that you're going to be playing all of those. But whatever the last note is in the progression of notes as you count from modal whole steps, that's typically kind of what you name the chord after, even though you might be dropping notes that along the way that would be okay. So, and then of course, if we did the last one, we're going to say we have the full, all of them, 7-note chord, C major 13. So it would be easier to call an Ionian 6 or a 7-note Ionian chord, or you could call it an Ionian C6 to be redundant, giving you the Ionian note and the C if you didn't know the collection of notes that you're in. And then of course that has all of the modal points in it, right? But again, if you're playing that last bit, that last one, the 13th, from an interval perspective, you're most likely you're going to have to drop something on the guitar because you only have 6 strings, right? but if you're going to be hitting that last one, that last interval, then, or from the Ionian's perspective, if you're hitting the Aeolian, then you're going to be doing like the 7-note chord, although you'll be dropping some of these ones in the middle somewhere, right? That's just how the naming convention kind of typically works. All right. What if we go then to the Dorian? If I'm building chords off of the Dorian, I ask ChatGPT, take that spring green, which is the Dorian color, right? Take that Dorian color and give me 5 shades on that. So I can do the same thing, building the chords up from there. So it would be a Dorian. So if I had a 3-note Dorian chord, then you could call that a D minor. But if you know the collection of notes that you're in, we're going to work in the same collection of notes around the C major, then it's redundant to name the D. I'd rather name it by the Dorian node, right? So instead of calling it a D minor chord, which could get confused with the A minor chord, I could get confused with the other minor chords, right? The other minor modes, because you don't know if it's a D Dorian or a D Aeolian, or if it's a D Phrygian. But if you say it's a Dorian, it's a 3-note Dorian chord, or it's a D2 chord, meaning start on the Dorian node and then go up 2 modal whole steps, or you could call it a DD Dorian, a DD2. Why? Because it's a Dorian and it's a D, right? It's going to be, meaning we're building it off the Dorian and the D. Now, if I already knew the collection of notes was the collection of notes around the key of C, then I would already know where the Dorian is by my shape, right? I would know, well, this is the shape here. I know that the continent of the Dorian is going to be here, so it would be redundant to call it a D. I already know that because you've told me what collection of notes I'm working in. But you could do that. So that would mean that we're going from a 0 node, which is the Dorian node, up 2 modal half steps or 2 shades of gray, up another 2, or a total distance of 4 shades of gray. So in other words, from a scale degree, that would be 1, 3, 5. If I made the Dorian node the 1, which I don't want to do because I want to be able to describe the nodes as different continents, which if I did, I could say I start on the Dorian and then I go up 2. So 2 plus 2 is 4, gets me to the Lydian, plus another 2 gets me to the Aeolian. Therefore, the Dorian chord, which is a minor chord, but more descriptively called a 3-note Dorian chord, would be the 2, 4, 6. It could be described by modal points. It's the Dorian, Lydian, and Aeolian nodes. Okay, so then, well, what if I go up another note? Then we're going to say that would be a D minor 7. Now you get the D minor 7 confused, whether it's built off the Dorian or whether it's built off the Aeolian or the Phrygian still. So it would be easier or better, more specific functionally to call it's a 4-note Dorian chord, or it's a Dorian 3 chord, meaning Dorian plus 3 modal whole steps to get to the last note. Or in other words, we're going to say if you start on the Dorian, you go up 2 to get to the 4, which is Lydian, up another 2 to get to the 6, which is Aeolian, up another 2, 7 around the horn to 1 gets you to the Ionian. So that means that when you're looking at the Dorian, if you say it's a 4-note chord, the last one that you're going to add, which is 6 modal half steps up. Why? Because you skip every other note, right? It's going to be 6 modal half steps up, which from a scale degree standpoint would be the 7th, because the scale degrees are always off by 1 by distance, is going to be the Ionian. So then we're going to say, let's do the next one and say that we're going to say, what if I have another note, another in there? It's going to be a D minor 9. A 9 is kind of equivalent to the 2 in essence, except possibly an octave up. It would be better to call it a Dorian 4 or a 5-note Dorian chord or a DD4. So it's a Dorian and a D chord, which is kind of redundant, again, if you already know what collection of notes that you're in. So that means you would be at the Dorian plus another 2 to the Lydian plus another 2 to the Aeolian plus another 2 to the Ionian plus another 2 to the Phrygian. So that means the end distance that we named the chord after is now 8 modal half steps away, right? 8 modal half steps away in terms of distance, which would mean it's the 9th scale degree. But really, you can only go a distance of 6. So right, so it would be 8 minus 7 would be 1, which would be the 2nd scale degree. So it would either be a 9 or a 2 in terms of scale degrees. All right, what if I add another one? So then we're going to say now we have a D minor 11. So we have the compound interval of the 11th. So it's going to be a spring green, darker shade now. I'd rather call it a Dorian 5 chord. So, and that would be a spring green Dorian 5 chord. And that's going to be then adding the Mixolydian. So we ended off at the Phrygian. Now we go up another 2. And the Mixolydian is the last one, which is distance-wise 10 modal half steps up. Why? Because we're going to say we start on the Dorian and then you go 5 modal whole steps up, which means we're skipping every other mode, which would be 10 modal half steps up, which would mean the scale degree has to be 11. Now, of course, again, there is no 11 is a compound interval because we're really going around the circle, right? So you'd have to say the 11 is equivalent to the 4. All right, and then we'd say, okay, one more. If we go up to the next one, then that's going to be a D minor 13, which I'd rather call a D6 or a 7-note Dorian chord. And so now we're just going to say it's 6 modal half steps, modal whole steps up. 6 times 2 is 12. 12 modal whole steps up would be the last note that you're defining the chord from, even if you drop some of the ones in the middle to get there typically, which would be off by 1 on scale degrees, which would be the 13 from a scale degree standpoint. From the node standpoint, you'd get all the way out here to the Locrian, the 7. All right, let's do the next one. We go down to the 3. So that's going to be the Phrygian. If we build off the Phrygian, we're going to take the sky blue, take that number, ChatGTP, and give me the breakout so I can name the difference for those. So here's the normal sky blue, a 3-note. Here's the breakout. So a 3-note then is going to be a light sky blue, which is going to be what I'm going to call shade 3 sky blue for a 3-note chord. And if we start on the Phrygian, again, I know that the Phrygian is a minor mode. So if I'm playing around the collection of notes of the C major, then I know where the Phrygian's going to be in respect to it, right? Here's the C major, there's the Phrygian. So I should be, the best way to describe it would be to say you're going to build a Phrygian chord, which I already know is a minor chord, but therefore it doesn't get confused with the Dorian minor chord or the Aeolian minor chord if I say it's a Phrygian chord, right? So I already know it's a minor chord because the Phrygian is the 3 from a natural number system, which builds a minor chord. It has a minor third, in other words, within it. So instead of saying E minor, which you could get confused with the other minors, that doesn't tell you whether it's in the Phrygian part of the fretboard or the Dorian part of the fretboard. you could do it this way. Now, again, you could drop the E entirely. You could say E, but you could just say it's a Phrygian 2 or a 3-note Phrygian chord if you know that you're in the collection of notes around the key of C. And that way, again, you can easily shift the entire song, right? Which is, again, the entire point. All of the 12 7-note collections move up and down the fretboard. So we should be naming our system functionally so that if I am playing with someone who is singing or whatever, whoever else is playing, and they need me to shift the whole thing up, it should be so easy to do, right? I should just be able, because I could just shift the whole thing, the whole collection of notes should shift up. I shouldn't need to change the name. I should just name the song. This is the collection of notes I'm playing in, and then name all the things that I'm playing within that collection of notes by relative modal point, which makes the whole thing shiftable really easily, right? That would be, again, I don't see how you could possibly argue that would not be the best way to do it, right? Okay. But in any case, so that would be then, so we're going to say that that's going to be a 1, 2, 4. So if I start on the Phrygian, I go up 2 to the Mixolydian, up to the Locrian. So what is a Phrygian 2 chord or a 3-note Phrygian? It's the 3, 5, 7 node, or Phrygian, Mixolydian, and Locrian nodes. That's another way that you could define the chord. The last, so then if I add another one, then that's going to be sky blue, but a shade darker. It's going to be the 4 shade sky blue. That would be an E minor 7, but that gets confused with the D minor 7 because they're not defining the node that we're building off, but rather the note. It would be better to define it by the node, the modal point, which would be a Phrygian 3. You could call it a Phrygian E3 to give you a redundancy of the node and the note, but to be nice. But it would be better to name your entire song with just a Phrygian 3, which is being played in the collection of notes around the C major so that you can shift the whole thing. It's a 4-note Phrygian chord. The last one is going to be 3 modal half steps, 3 modal whole steps up. 3 times 2 is 6. So the last one is going to be 6 modal half steps away, or 7 off by 1 from a scale degree standpoint. So we're adding the 7. It would be a 3 plus 2 is 5, plus 2 is 7, plus 2 is 2 if we go around the horn. That means that the Phrygian 3 chord would be a 3, which would be a 4-note chord. It would be the 3, 5, 7, 2, or Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian, and Dorian nodes. All right, and then the next one is going to be an E minor flat 9. Now, the fact that we need a flat 9 is it'll from a naming convention. You shouldn't need it because we're not going outside the same collection of notes, it'd be a lot easier just to say it's going to be a Phrygian 4 chord, or a 5-note Phrygian chord, or a Phrygian E4 if we want to be redundant. That means that the last note that we're adding is going to be 4 modal whole steps, or 4 times 2, which would be 8 modal half steps up, which would mean it would be 9 from a scale degree, remembering that 9 is a compound interval equivalent to the 2, right? So it's really 8 minus 7, because there's only, which would give me to the 1, right? And then that would be off by 1 to get you to the 2, because the 9 is equivalent to the 2 in essence. So that would be the 3, 5, 7, 2, and then 4. All right, and then if we do the next one, then of course we have now an E minor 11 flat 9, which is again quite ugly, but we can trim it down by just saying it's going to be a Phrygian 5 chord, or Phrygian E5 chord, or a 6-note Phrygian chord. The last note that we're going to be adding is going to be 5 modal whole steps up. 5 times 2 would be 10, so it's 10 modal half steps up, which would be 11 scale degrees, because the scale degrees are off by 1. 11 is a compound interval. 11 minus 7 would be equivalent to the 6, right? All right. So then the next one is going to be, finally, on this one, we'd have an E minor 13, flat 9, flat 13, which again, if I said that right, I'm pretty sure that's pretty ugly. We shouldn't have to do that because nothing's outside the, it'd be, all we have to do is say it's a Phrygian 6 or a 7-note Phrygian chord, meaning the last note that we're adding is 6 modal whole steps away. 6 times 2 means it's 12 modal half steps away, which would mean from a scale degree it's the 13, which is a compound interval, which is equivalent to the 6. The last one was equivalent to the 4. I think I got that mixed up. Sorry about that. So that's that one. So that's going to be that whole thing. All right, let's do the next one. So we're going to say, what if we have the 4 is Lydian? So we asked chat, hey, chat, take this blue, and make it give me the shades of blue. I'm a little bit less nice to chat now because chat 4 was really cordial and nice, but then I think too many people fell in love with it. So now they made chat 5 seems a lot more cold and distancy. I don't know. So now now I don't even care if chat, I don't try to talk nice to it anymore because it's kind of cold and distancy now. So it's like, chat, just give me the 5 things. Anyways, so that's going to be the Lydian. So now we're going to say, so we have, this is the normal blue, but it's the light blue now. Is that seems awfully light. I guess that's right. That's the light blue. It's an F major. So again, the F major is based on the note. It'd be better to name it on the mode. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Like, how could it not be better to write your song? Like, we're going to get into the MIDI stuff later and like software. How in the world would you not want to write your entire song by relative modal distance so that you could move the song through any of the 12 collections of 7 notes? I mean, it seems to me that that's just like, that's like, how would you not want to do it that way, right? I mean, I don't get it, man. There's something, anyway. So this is a Lydian F2, so we could just call it a 3-note Lydian, right? Which means that the last note in it is going to be 2 modal whole steps up. 2 times 2 is 4, so it's going to be 4 modal half steps up, which means it would be the 5th scale degree. So it would be a 2-4, a 1-2-4, a 0-2-4 for modal half steps, and a 1-3-5 for scale degrees. But I don't want to make the first one the 1. I want to keep it as the 4, because then I can just count up. 4 plus 2 is 6, plus 2 is 7, and then back to 1. That means that a Lydian 2 chord, or 3-note Lydian, consists of a Lydian, Aeolian, and Ionian node, which is very descriptive and therefore useful, I believe. Then we're going to say that this is going to be another note. So now we're going to say it's bluer, but a shade 4 of blue, which is going to be an F major 7. So 7 is the last note we add from a scale degree standpoint, but it would be easier to say it's a Phrygian 3 or a Phrygian F3 if we want to be redundant, or a 4-note Phrygian chord. The 3 represents the last note that we would be adding, which is 3 modal whole steps up, which 3 times 2 means it would be 6 modal half steps up, which means if we add 1 to that, it would be 7 scale degree up. That's the last node that we would be adding. I'd like to keep it this way because I could say it's the 4, the 6, the 1 plus another 2 is the 3, so that last 1, which is going to be 6 modal half steps up, or 7 scale degree up, would be the Phrygian node that we would be adding, okay? And then we can go to the next one, which is going to be an F major 9, which is going to be the darker blue. So now we're adding the compound interval. I'd rather call it a Phrygian 4 chord, or a Phrygian F4 chord, or a 5-note Phrygian chord, 4 representing the last note, 4 modal whole steps up. 4 times 2 would be 8 modal half steps up, plus 1 would be the 9th scale degree, which is a compound interval, which is kind of equivalent to the 2 we left off on the 3 node. If we add another 2, that last one that we would be adding, which is 8 modal half steps up of the 9th scale degree, which would be the Mixolydian node. See how descriptive that is? That's like, it's wonderful, full of wonder. And then the next one would be an F major sharp 11, right? Which is a Lydian, I'd rather call it an Lydian F5, or just a Lydian 5 or a 6-note Lydian chord. 5 modal whole steps up is the last note that we're adding. 5 times 2 is 10, which would be the modal half step distance, plus 1 would be 11, the 11th scale degree. We left off last time adding the Mixolydian. That means plus 2 gets us to the 7, the last one, which is 10 modal half steps up, or the 11th scale degree, which would be the Locrian node. And then if we have the next one, we're going to say it's an F major 13 flat 11, which you could just call a Lydian F6 chord, or just a Lydian 6 chord, or a 7-note Lydian chord, 6 being the last note that you would add, which is 6 modal whole steps up from the root, which would be 6 times 2, 12 modal half steps up, plus 1 would be 13 scale degrees away, which is a compound interval, which is really a 6 in essence, the 6th scale degree. And then that would be the Dorian. The Dorian node would be 12 modal half steps up, which would be the 13th scale degree in that case. All right, let's do the next one. Almost there. This is running long. We've got the Mixolydian. So we're going to say, hey, chat, take this magenta and make it into 5 things, and don't give me any lip. I know you won't, because you're not very nice anymore. Just do it. Just get the job done. All right, and then chat gives you this one. So now we're on the G. That would be a G major, but that doesn't really distinguish if you're starting from the 1, the 4, or the 5. But it would if you said it's a Mixolydian 2 chord or a 3-note Mixolydian. You could be redundant and call it a Mixolydian G2. But if you already know that you're in the collection of notes around the C major, you've already named the collection of notes. I don't need to put the note name, and I, in fact, don't want to put the note name in the song thing, because I'd like to be able to tell my singer or whoever I'm working with that, yeah, we can move the collection of notes up very easily, because all the notation will just move right on up because of the way we named it, which is how we should be naming everything. Everything needs to be transposed and fixed, okay? We have the tools to do it now. I don't want to hear any complaining. People whine about it. That's not the way we've done. We've got ChatGTP can do it. Anyway, so that means that we're going to say that's a 0, 2, 4. The last note is going to be 2 modal whole steps up. And that means it's going to be 2 times 2 is 4 modal half steps up. Plus 1 means the 5th scale degree is the last scale degree. That would be a 5 plus 2 plus 2 would be 5, 7, and 2, because there's only 7 notes. That would mean that the Mixolydian, 3-note Mixolydian, is consisting of the Mixolydian, Locrian, and Dorian node, clearly. So then if we add another note, it would be a G7. They made this whole other thing for the 7 chords, Mixolydian chords, a G7. You might as well have just called it a Mixolydian 3. That's just as easy. Or Mixolydian G3 if you want to be redundant. Or a 4-note Mixolydian. The reason the 3 is better, because that represents distance of 3 modal whole steps times 2 would give us then the 6 modal half steps, which would be off by 1 to give us to the 7th scale degree that they measured stupidly. And that means that if we have the 5, 7, 2 plus another 2, that 6 modal half step away distance, or the 7th scale degree, would be the Lydian node. The Lydian node is what we're defining the chord by, the last one that we're adding, not by a scale degree, but by the distance. So now we've got then the G9, which I would like to call a Mixolydian 4 or Mixolydian G4 if we want to be redundant, a 5-note Mixolydian. I'd rather call it Mixolydian 4 because the 4 represents the distance from the node in whole steps, modal whole steps that is, meaning 4 times 2 would give us 8 modal half steps, plus 1 would give us the scale degree, which is off by 1, the 9, the compound interval. The last node that we add, we were on the 4, that takes us to the 6. The 6 or Aeolian node is what we're naming the chord by. It's 8 modal half steps up, or 9th scale degree, which is equivalent to the 2 or 2nd scale degree. All right, and then so now we're going to say the next one is a G11. I'd like to call it a Mixolydian G5 or a 6-note Mixolydian. That means the 5 is 5 modal whole steps up. 5 times 2 is 10 modal half steps up. 10 plus 1 would be the 11th scale degree, which is equivalent to the 4th scale degree, because that's a compound interval or whatever. So that means that we left off last time on the 6, 7 to 1. If we add 2 to it, that means that 10 modal half steps away, or 11 scale degrees, which is equivalent to 4 away, is going to be giving us the Ionian node, which is what we named the chord off of. And then we can say the next one is a G13. So that's going to be a Mixolydian, I'd call it a Mixolydian 6 or Mixolydian G6 or 7-note Mixolydian chord. The 6 represents the distance from the node to get to the last note, which is 6 modal whole steps up. 6 times 2 would be 12 modal half steps up, plus 1 would give us the off by 1 scale degree of 13, which is equivalent to 6 from a scale degree standpoint in essence. We left off last time on the 1. 1 plus 2 means the 3. That means that the Phrygian would be 12 modal half steps up, or 13 scale degrees up, which we named the chord by. All right, let's go to then, what are we on? Man, this is crazy. We're on the Aeolian. Aeolian, so we said, hey, chat, take this red and give us 5 breakouts from that. Just get the job done, chat. It's like, there you go. All right. Don't get too attached. Chat's like, don't get too attached. Too many people trying to marry me over here. Okay, I won't get attached, chat. Just get the job done. We got stuff to do. We're going to say this is going to be Aeolian, and then we're going to say this is going to be an A minor chord. I'd rather call it an Aeolian A2 chord, or 3-note or triad Aeolian chord. The 2 representing 2 modal whole steps up. 2 times 2 would be 4 modal half steps up, which would be the 5th scale degree. If I start on the Aeolian node, plus 2 is 7, and then around the horn to 1, plus 2 would give us 3, meaning the Aeolian chord, a 3-note Aeolian chord, would be a 6-1-3 or Aeolian Ionian Phrygian node chord. All right, and then if I add another note, it would be an A minor 7, which would be a shade darker of the red. That I would rather call it an Aeolian A3, or just an Aeolian 3, or a 4-note Aeolian. That 3 represents 4 modal whole steps up from the root. 3 times 2 would give us 6 modal half steps up, plus 1 would be 7. The 7th scale degree. Last time we were on the 3, plus 2 gets us to the Mixolydian. That Mixolydian is 6 modal half steps up, or 7 scale degrees up, which is what we named the chord based on. We have another one. Now, the next note up would give us an A minor 9, 9 being the equivalent to the 2 in essence. I'd rather call it an Aeolian A4, or just an Aeolian 4, or a 5-note Aeolian. The reason I like the A4 is because the 4 is the distance in whole steps, which I can take times 2, meaning it's 8 half steps up to get to that last note, which means plus 1 off by 1 scale degree would be 9, which is equivalent to the 2nd scale degree. That left off last time on the 5 note, adding another 2 to the 7. That means that this 7, or the Locrian node, is the 8 modal half step away distance, or the 9th scale degree, which is equivalent to the 2nd, which we named the chord after. All right, and then let's do what if we add another one? It would be an A minor 11, which I'd like to call an AA5, or just an Aeolian 5, or a 6-note Aeolian chord. The 5 represents the distance from the Aeolian node in whole steps. 5 times 2 would be 10, meaning the distance of the last note from the root would be 10 modal half steps up, plus 1 would be 11 scale degrees up. The last note that we're going to add, we were on the 7. Now we go 7 plus 2 to 2 as we go around the horn. That means the Dorian node is the one we named the chord off of, which is 10 modal half steps up or 11 scale degrees up, or in other words, it's the 4 from a local distance standpoint. All right, and then we're going to go to the next one, otra vez. It's going to be an A minor flat 13, ugly interval. It'd be a lot, or an ugly chord name. It'd be easier just to call it an AA6, or we could just call it an Aeolian 6 chord or a 7-note Aeolian chord. The 6 representing modal whole steps from the Aeolian node. 6 times 2 would be 12 modal half steps, plus 1 would be 13th scale degree that we would be naming the chord off of. In other words, we left off last time on the 2 Dorian, plus another 2 gets us to the 4. We're naming the chord off of the Lydian that we will be holding down, which is 12 modal half steps up or 13 scale degrees, which is equivalent from a local distance to the 6 scale degree. All right, finally, we got crazy Locrian. We're finishing it off crazy. So get ready. We said, hey, chat, take this yellow and give me the breakout. And they're like, boom, there it is. Don't try to, man, that's helpful, chat. Thank you don't try to date me. Okay, I'm not. I'm just saying, you're amazing, chat. You're amazing. Okay. It's hard not to get attached. I'm going to say, okay, so this is going to be a B diminished. So we have this diminished, which is a whole nother term that we had to kind of come up with. We talked about it before, but it would be easier to just call it, it's a Locrian B2 chord, or just a Locrian 2 modal whole steps, or a 3-note Locrian. The 2 representing modal whole steps from the root note. 2 times 2 is 4, meaning it would be, the last note would be 4 modal half steps up, plus 1 would be 5 scale degrees up. So that means that if we started on the Locrian, the 7, plus 2, we go around the horn, would get us to 2, plus 2 gets us to 4. So the Locrian chord can be defined as the 7-2-4, or Locrian, Dorian, Lydian. And the Lydian is the last node that we're kind of naming the chord off of, which is 4 modal whole steps up, which would be 5 scale degrees, the 5th scale degree, okay? So let's say we add another note. Now they had to come up with another term, which is a B half diminished 7, because the half diminished was, again, I don't want to get it, we talked about it before, but again, it'd be a lot easier to just say you're doing a Locrian B3, or a Locrian 3 chord, 3 modal whole steps, or a 4-note Locrian chord, and then you could just say, well, the 3 represents 3 modal whole steps to get to the last note that we're naming the chord after, meaning 3 times 2 is 6 modal whole steps up, plus 1 would be the 7th scale degree, or in other words, we left off on the 4, plus 2 gets us to the 6, or the Aeolian node. We're naming the chord based on the Aeolian node distance, because that's the distance of 6 modal half steps from the Locrian, or the 7th scale degree. Let's go up another one. Now we just kind of stick with this B half diminished 9 that they made up this half diminished, which you might as well just call it the mode. It's just be the Locrian B4 chord, 4 modal whole steps, or just a Locrian 4 modal whole steps, or a 5-note Locrian. The 4 represents 4 modal whole steps up from the node of the Locrian. 4 times 2 would be 8 modal half steps, plus 1 would give us the off by 1/9 scale degree, which would be equivalent to the 2nd from a scale degree standpoint. For a local scale degree, we're naming this thing off of the last node, which is now the Ionian, because we left off on the 6, plus 2 is 7, and then 1. So therefore, the Ionian that we're naming this thing by, because it's the last one we're adding, is 8 modal half steps up, or the 9th scale degree, which is equivalent to the 2nd from a local scale degree standpoint. Adding another one, B half diminished 11, which is another lower shade of yellow. I would rather call it a Locrian B5 or just a Locrian 5 modal whole steps or a 6-note Locrian. The 5 represent 5 modal whole steps from the root node. It's a distance term. 5 times 2 would be 10 modal half steps. 10 plus 1 would be the 11th scale degree that we're naming the chord based on. That's going to be from a nodal standpoint. We left off on the 1 plus 2 gives us the 3. The Phrygian node is the node we named the chord off of, which is 10 modal half steps up, which would be 11th scale degrees, which would be equivalent to a local scale degree distance of 4. All right, and then finally, we have a B half diminished 13, which I'd rather call a Locrian B6 modal whole steps, or just a Locrian 6 modal whole steps, or a 7-note Locrian chord, which would be then 6 modal whole steps up to get to the last note in the chord that we're naming the chord based on. 6 times 2 would be 12 modal half steps up, plus 1 would be the 13th scale degree, which is equivalent to the local scale of 6. And we have then left off on the 3, plus 2 gets us to the 5. So the 5, or the Mixolydian node, is what we're naming the chord on, which has a distance of 12 modal half steps up, or the 13th scale degree, which is equivalent to the local scale degree of 6. All right? Whew, man, that was a lot. All right, so we have the color system applied out to this whole thing, adding. So now we could again actually name all of our chords with just the color system. And like I say, the whole thing, I really feel like we should be going through all the music that you know, right? And rewriting it with ChatGTP so that we remove the note names and write it just by relative node names. Again, that's just the functional thing to do. It's just the logical thing to do, because then you have all of your music in such a way that you can play it not only as it was originally composed in the key composed, but easily transposed to all 12 sets of 7 notes. That's just, again, it just seems like the just obvious thing to do. That would be, we have the capacity to do it now, because you can argue we couldn't do it before, but now we got equivalent to the printing press right now. So you could it's like taking the Bible and printing it. You could take all the songs and make them functionally superior so that anybody can play them and then play with them and change the keys at will. That should, to me, that's just an obvious thing to do. If someone can see why we wouldn't do that, I'd love to hear the argument.